The day had started innocuously enough. Another beautiful morning in the vast Utah wilderness. Hiking through the Wasatch Range had become something of a personal tradition, a way to unplug, decompress, and find peace amid nature's rugged beauty. I'd been hiking for hours, reveling in the fresh mountain air and the solitude that came with being miles from the nearest town. Everything had been perfect until I stumbled upon that strange campsite. I hadn't meant to find it. In fact, I had deviated off the trail, drawn by a sudden urge to explore a particularly dense section of forest. The trees grew close together here, their branches weaving an almost impenetrable canopy above. I wouldn't have noticed the sight at all had it not been for the faint smell of smoke, burnt wood tinged with something else, something sweet and acrid, like incense. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed through the underbrush toward the scent. What I found made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't just an ordinary campsite. The logs were arranged in a perfect circle, the fire pit at its center neatly lined with stones. There were remnants of something that had burned recently, ashes still glowing faintly in the pit, but it was the symbols carved into the trees surrounding the camp that chilled me to the bone. Strange, unfamiliar symbols, almost runic, cut deep into the bark in patterns that made no sense. They seemed ancient, deliberately placed, and ominous. I backed away, suddenly feeling as though I was intruding on something I shouldn't be part of. The forest, once a peaceful haven, had turned oppressive, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and an instinct I didn't know I had screamed at me to leave. Just as I turned to head back to the trail, I heard it, a branch snapping behind me, then another. Someone was out there, watching me. I froze, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear. There was another sound now, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, moving through the brush toward me. Panic set in. I wasn't alone, and whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I bolted. Branches whipped against my face as I tore through the forest, my only thought to get back to the trail and away from whoever or whatever was following me. The footsteps quickened behind me, matching my pace, and I could hear the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs. They were chasing me. My lungs burned as I ran, the weight of my backpack pulling me down, slowing me just enough that I could feel the hot breath of fear on my neck. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, my legs moving on autopilot, fueled by pure adrenaline. The trail was close. I just had to reach it, and then I could make my way back to the parking lot where my car was waiting. But when I finally broke through the trees and onto the trail, my heart sank. My car wasn't just waiting for me, it was surrounded. 3 figures dressed in dark clothing and wearing hoods that obscured their faces stood around the vehicle. One of them was crouched by the rear tire, a knife glinting in his hand as he methodically slashed it. Another stood by the driver's door, watching the forest like a sentry, while the third lingered by the hood, holding something I couldn't quite make out. I skidded to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. They hadn't seen me yet. For a moment, I considered doubling back into the woods, hiding until they left. Then the one by the driver's door turned, and his eyes locked onto mine. There was a moment of stillness, a heartbeat where neither of us moved, and then, like a wolf that had spotted its prey, he pointed and shouted. They were coming for me. I sprinted down the trail, my legs screaming in protest as I pushed them harder than I ever had before. I could hear the pounding of feet behind me, faster, more deliberate this time. They weren't just following me, they were hunting me. The forest became a blur around me, my vision tunneling as I focused on nothing but escape. Every breath was a struggle, every step felt like it might be my last, but I couldn't stop. Somehow, I made it to the parking lot at the trailhead. It was empty, save for my car and a few others parked in the far corner, their owners presumably still out on the trails, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in the woods. I threw myself toward the nearest car, banging on the window in desperation, but no one answered. The lot was eerily silent, the stillness only broken by my panicked gasps for air and the pounding footsteps drawing nearer. I had nowhere to run. My car was useless with its slashed tires, and the others were locked tight. My only chance was to hide. I spotted a maintenance shed at the far end of the lot, half hidden behind some trees, and I ran for it, praying the door would be unlocked. By some miracle it was. I slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as I could, and crouched in the shadows listening. My heart hammered in my chest, loud enough that I was sure they could hear it. The footsteps slowed as they entered the parking lot, and I heard voices, low, murmured words I couldn't make out, followed by the crunch of gravel as they spread out, searching. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense as I waited, terrified that they would find me. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I sat in the dark, my mind racing. Who were these people? What did they want with me? The campsite, the symbols, the way they had followed me so deliberately, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voices faded and the footsteps retreated. I didn't move. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I dared to breathe again. Slowly, cautiously, I cracked the door open and peered outside. The parking lot was empty. I slipped out of the shed and made my way back to my car, keeping low and scanning the trees for any sign of movement. My car was still there, the tires shredded beyond repair. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. The next few hours passed in a blur. The police arrived quickly, and I recounted the entire ordeal to a stern-looking officer who took notes with grim efficiency. They checked the forest but found no trace of the people who had chased me. The officer reassured me that I was safe now, that they would keep an eye on the area, but his words did little to calm my nerves. Something about the way he spoke made me think he knew more than he was letting on, as if this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The officer drove me to the nearest town while I waited for a tow truck to retrieve my car. The town was small, just a few streets lined with old buildings, and it had the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if everyone knew something they weren't willing to talk about. I checked into a cheap motel, too exhausted and shaken to drive home that night. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols carved into the trees, the strange campsite, and the people who had chased me. I did some research online, trying to find anything that might explain what I had seen, but all I came across were vague mentions of cult activity in the region. Nothing concrete, just rumors and old news reports about disappearances in the area, unsolved cases dating back decades. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. The reports were all eerily similar: hikers, campers, and locals who had ventured too deep into the woods and never returned. In some cases, their bodies were found days or weeks later, showing signs of exposure but with no clear cause of death. In other cases, they were never found at all. The police had written them off as accidents, the natural dangers of hiking in remote areas. But after what I had experienced, I wasn't so sure. As the days passed, the terror of that hike stayed with me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hooded figures in the forest, felt the chill of being watched. My sleep was plagued with nightmares of being chased through the trees, of stumbling upon that strange campsite again and again, each time feeling the presence of something sinister lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had gotten too close to something I wasn't supposed to see, that the people in the woods weren't just random criminals or squatters. There was something darker at play, something ancient and hidden. Even though I had escaped, I couldn't help but feel like they were still out there, watching, waiting. It's been years since that hike, but the memories haven't faded. Every time I go into the woods, I can't help but look over my shoulder, expecting to see those hooded figures lurking in the shadows. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't stray off the trail. No matter where I am, whether I'm in the heart of a city or miles away from civilization, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I'm not going to call myself an expert hiker, but I've been avidly enjoying the activity for decades. I've traversed all the major trails in the US and visited over 75% of the national parks in this beautiful country. With so much experience, I've had to find new ways to keep things exciting. Recently, I started using Google Maps to find unnamed forests and explore them. It's unconventional, sure, but I think the added thrill is worth the risk of getting lost, or at least I used to think so. I carry a pack of homemade route marking stickers. They're simple, just bright colored pieces of tape that I can stick onto trees as I go, so I don't lose my way. As I retrace my steps, I pull the stickers off, leaving no trace behind. I'm surprised more people don't use this trick. It's incredibly useful and practically makes getting lost impossible. I've been doing it for years, and it's never failed me. Well, until recently. A few weeks ago, I decided to check out Dudleytown Forest in Connecticut. If you're not familiar with the place, it's an abandoned area that's been empty since the 1800s. There are all sorts of spooky stories about the forest. People say it's haunted, that it's cursed. Some even claim the entire town was cursed, which is why it was abandoned in the first place. You should do some research if you're interested in that sort of thing. I'm not much for ghost stories or superstitions, so I didn't think much of it. To me, it was just another forest, off the beaten path and, importantly, off limits to the public. But that never really stopped me before. The idea of exploring a place where no one would likely be was appealing. I wouldn't run into anyone, and the eerie silence would just add to the thrill. Plus, I'm from New England, so it wasn't a long drive for me. I figured it would be a fun, challenging day hike. I arrived at the edge of the forest around noon. It was a bright, sunny day, perfect for hiking. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of daylight so I wouldn't get caught out there after dark. As soon as I stepped into the woods, though, I felt off. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. I had heard people say it was dead silent, but I didn't really believe it. I thought it was just one of those exaggerated things people say to make a place seem more mysterious. But no, they were right. It was unnervingly quiet. In most forests, there's a constant hum of life, the wind rustling the leaves, birds chirping, animals scurrying. Here, there was nothing, just silence. You don't realize how much you rely on those little sounds until they're gone. It felt like being in a soundproof room, where the only thing you can hear is your own breathing. I've been in forests like this before, places where there aren't many animals, but this was different. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. Still, I pushed forward, sticking my markers on trees as I went. I figured I'd get used to it after a while, that the uneasiness would fade. And it did, for a time. I hiked for what felt like hours, just enjoying the solitude and the challenge of navigating this strange, quiet forest. But the longer I walked, the more I started to feel like something was wrong. I kept expecting to see some sign of life, a bird, a squirrel, anything, but there was nothing. It was as if the entire forest was frozen in time, untouched by anything living. It was unsettling. I even started hoping I'd run into another person, just to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over me. But there was no one, just me, the trees, and the deafening silence. I started to calm down after a while, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Forests can be weird sometimes. This was just one of those times. But then, out of nowhere, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a wailing sound, a moaning, like something was in pain. It was distant at first, just barely audible over the silence, but it grew louder the longer I stood there. It sounded like a wounded animal, the kind of noise you'd expect from something that's been seriously hurt. But there was something off about it. I can't quite describe it, but it didn't sound natural. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make. It was too high-pitched, too drawn out, like someone or something was mimicking the sound of a wounded creature. I stood there for a few minutes, just listening, trying to figure out what it could be. My first thought was that it might be the wind, but there wasn't any wind. The trees were completely still. Then I thought it could be some kind of animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but that didn't make sense either. There were no animals in these woods. I hadn't seen or heard a single one since I arrived. The sound kept going, getting louder, more insistent, and I realized I needed to move. I didn't want to find out what was making that noise. I turned and walked away from it, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, just the wind, but I knew it wasn't. Something about that sound was wrong, and it was coming from deep in the forest. I kept walking, faster now, my eyes scanning the trees for my trail markers. I knew I was close to the halfway point of my hike, and I told myself that if anything else strange happened, I'd turn back. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. There, on the tree in front of me, were carvings. They weren't words or symbols I recognized, just strange slashes and marks, as if someone had hacked at the tree with a knife. I looked around and saw that several of the trees nearby had the same marks. That was enough for me. I wasn't going to stick around to see what else this forest had in store. I turned around and started heading back, unsticking my trail markers as I went. I was on high alert now, every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch setting me on edge. The forest was still dead silent, but now it felt like the silence was watching me. I kept walking, faster than before, desperate to get out of there. But after a while, I noticed something strange. The markers I had left behind weren't where they should have been. At first, I thought I had just missed one or two, but then I saw the markers were still there, but they were lower than they should have been. I always placed them at shoulder height, but now they were at waist height. Someone had moved them. My stomach dropped. I turned around and saw, off in the distance, what looked like a cave or a bear's den. It wasn't there before. There was no way I would have missed something like that. That's when I realized what had happened. Someone had been following me, moving my markers, trying to lead me toward that cave. I didn't stick around to find out why. I turned and ran, faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't care about making noise. The forest was dead silent anyway. My only thought was to get out, to find my way back to my car. I pulled out my phone, praying for signal, and by some miracle, I had 1 bar. I quickly checked the map and found my car's location. I wasn't far, just a few minutes away. Then the signal dropped. It didn't matter. I knew where I was going now. But just as I started moving again, the wailing sound returned, louder and closer than before. It was like it was right behind me, but every time I looked back, I saw nothing. I ran harder than I ever have in my life, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound growing louder with every step. It felt like it was chasing me, like it was right on my heels, but I never saw anything. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through the edge of the forest. The moment I stepped out, the wailing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't waste any time. I jumped into my car and sped off, not looking back. That day changed hiking for me. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe there was someone living in those woods, someone who noticed me and decided to mess with me for fun. Maybe they had some kind of whistle to make that noise, and that's why it stopped when I left the forest. But even as I write this, I know there are holes in my explanation. How could someone keep up with me while blowing a whistle that loudly, for that long? How could they move so silently through a forest that was dead quiet? And why didn't I ever see them? I don't have all the answers, and maybe I never will. But one thing's for sure, there's a reason that forest is off limits to the public.